Hi, this is Environmental Psychology Part 7, Conclusions from a Meta-Analysis of 30 Years of Social Science Research on Wind Energy. My name is Sean Duffy. I'm a professor at Rutgers, Camden, and this lecture is part of a series that's affiliated with the New Jersey Wind Initiative that's part of Rutgers, New Brunswick. I just wanted to state that today was such a beautiful day that I decided to take my lectures from my office to outside, and I'm here on Cherry Street Pier in Philadelphia. And in the background you can see that's the Ben Franklin Bridge, and over my shoulder is where Rutgers Camden is located. So I'm near campus, but it was such a beautiful day that I thought it was worth going outside. So in 2017, Joseph Rand and Ben Hohen of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published an article in the journal Energy Research and Social Science, which provided a meta-analysis of 30 years of behavioral research on how people think about wind energy. Now, what a meta-analysis is, in general, it's a technique that statisticians use in order to summarize findings across a great variety of studies. Now, I don't think that in this paper they did a formal meta-analysis, but it was a more informal review of 30 years of research that's looked at the impacts that wind energy has had on individuals and communities. And what I think that this article provides is a set of best practices that can be used by those in the wind industry who might not be social sciences and might not be familiar with social science research, but their practice engages people that involved with wind energy. So you might be an engineer talking about wind energy informally, and what this article really presents are a set of suggestions in terms of how to deal with the community and other people who are impacted by wind energy. So I'm going to discuss each of their suggestions below. Here's the paper. It's from the journal Energy Research and Social Science, and I will link to the article in the module on Canvas. So you'll have a link to this. So one thing to point out is that overall support is high for wind energy in general, and attitudes are largely positive. So what I provide here is a recent study by Pew showing support for various forms of energy. And while solar power seems to have the strongest support at 84%, wind turbine farms have support at about 77%. Now, this study didn't differentiate terrestrial wind farms from those that are offshore, but suffices to say that support for wind is much higher than support for other forms of energy, such as nuclear, and certainly much more than those technologies that are going to contribute to climate change, such as oil and gas drilling, hydraulic fracturing, and coal mining. So there's a lot of support. And in the article, they studied that about 70 to 90% of North Americans approve of wind energy generally, and support has been high for specific existing and proposed wind facilities as well. So it's a great thing that most Americans are relatively positive about wind energy. However, most Americans don't live in great proximity to wind turbines. Here, where I am in Philadelphia, there's no wind turbine to be seen. So it relatively impacts people in Philadelphia very little. But if you live, for instance, the Jersey Shore, you might be more impacted because whatever your livelihood is, whether it be fishing or whether it be if you own Airbnb, something like that, that might impact the likelihood that someone might stay at your B&B, or it might impact your fishing. So I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that when we're talking about wind, that we need to consider the communities in which wind energy will be installed, and which communities are proximate to these wind turbines, and take into consideration their concerns, because those individuals are going to have the most severe reaction to the installation of such facilities. So the meta-analysis suggests that researchers should cautiously avoid a positive research lens. Viewing opposition merely as something to be overcome reduces the quality of research and prevents meaningful understandings and implementation of best practices. The motivation of wind energy acceptance research should not be exclusively to ensure approval of wind energy developments. Now, what they're suggesting here is that researchers need to be cautious about only presenting the positive side of wind energy. There are negative sides of it as well that need to be addressed. There's the cost of the infrastructure itself. There's the impact that these turbines might have on wildlife. These things are not things that should be just brushed under the rug in order for conveniently to get approval of projects. I think that taking into consideration the concerns of community members and stakeholders is a really important part of getting approval and getting support of the community at the end. The next suggestion deals with a term that you may know called NIMBYism. Now, NIMBY is an acronym for Not in My Backyard, and it is a pejorative term that's used to describe people who oppose any kind of development in their community out of the fact that they don't want anything to change from the status quo. So, for instance, building an apartment building in a neighborhood of single-family homes, often there's opposition because people prefer in their neighborhood homes that are like their own. They're worried about traffic and things like that. This also applies to wind turbines as well. People have an attachment to their place. They have attachment to their communities. And these big infrastructure projects are going to be permanent fixtures now in their community. And so they have a right to have concerns and objections to these installation of these projects because they will permanently alter their landscape. But I think that it's important for researchers and those who discuss with the community to avoid this pejorative term. The NIMBY explanation has been widely discredited as a simplistic, pejorative, politically inappropriate, and unhelpful as a framework to explain public attitudes toward wind facilities both before and after they are built. Nonetheless, the use of the term persists among the wind industry, policymakers, and even researchers. I just recommend that people bury that term and try to avoid it and try to avoid thinking within that framework. Because again, people have a right to have concerns about big infrastructure projects in their own communities. Another suggestion that they make in this meta-analysis is that incorporating research in the practice has lagged. Research over the past 30 years has produced many important insights, but these lessons have been slow to transition into practice among developers and policymakers. As a researcher myself, I find that often you do a very interesting study, whether it be on offshore wind or on some other thing that you're studying, and you write a paper, you submit it to a journal, it gets published, and then there's silence. You might get 1 or 2 emails about it, but for the most part, the research goes, unaddressed, and it's almost as if the research didn't happen at all. So I think that this is an important thing to keep in mind, is that as a researcher, you need to be a promoter of your own work. You need to go to conferences, you need to go to meetups and be able to talk to people who are various aspects of this whole wind initiative. So whether it be engineers or whether it be people that are in the business side of wind, I think it's really important to be able to not just have them be able to read your research, but also be able to understand your research. Because, in the world of academics, you might write a paper that is full of statistics. Your average person doesn't understand, advanced statistics. And so I think that it's important to be able to distill your work into bite-sized pieces and be able to make it so that your average person who's not a statistician or not a researcher would be able to understand. The next suggestion is that perceptions of turbine performance and reliability matter. Early studies revealed widespread concerns about turbine performance and reliability. More recently, studies have found a preference for turbines in motion compared to static turbines. This is actually an interesting one. When you talk to people in the community, and I've talked to dozens and dozens of people about wind, one of the strange perceptions that often comes up is, why do some of these turbines just stand still? People have a misunderstanding that the energy needs increase and decrease, and that also that turbines need to be shut off from time to time for maintenance. So it's very interesting that people's perceptions of turbines in action actually affect their beliefs about this. So it's something that should be kept in mind when designing wind farms, and something that probably should be discussed more when talking about the operation of wind turbines with the community. The next suggestion that they make in the meta-analysis is that demographics do not explain much. Throughout the literature, demographic variables such as gender, income, and education level do little to explain variation in wind energy attitudes. Some studies have shown contradictory evidence related to these variables. This has been one of the frustrating things that, when you're looking at the literature, prior literature on this, is that you find that, one study might show that there's support among certain demographics, like, whether it be political affiliation or, the degree to which people believe in environmental attitudes and behavior, but it's not uniform. But this is something which is true about all research. Most effects that we see in most research are not what we call main effects, meaning there's not like a direct effect of gender or your political affiliation or what generation that you're a part of, but that there's interactions. So there might be an interaction between your political affiliation and, for instance, how close you live to a proposed offshore wind project. So I think that what the problem here is that people are looking for simple demographic explanations, and I think that in reality most of these explanations are far more complex and require looking at interaction effects, not just main effects. Next, they suggest that socioeconomic impacts are very important. Local stakeholders are concerned with various socioeconomic impacts, and some researchers have found that socioeconomic concerns to be paramount among local residents. In general, those living near wind facilities want benefits that stay in the local community, and they feel a sense of injustice about bearing the burden of costs when consumption of and profits related to the power are enjoyed elsewhere. This is one when I talk to people who live in regions of New Jersey that are close to where they are proposing the installation of these wind turbines. They really are concerned about where the benefit of this is going to go. A lot of people brought up the idea that and the notion that other states are going to benefit from these wind turbines more than people who live in New Jersey, that foreign countries are going to benefit more because some of the technology that's developed, that is used in offshore wind, comes from foreign-owned corporations. So this is something which is a concern that people who are promoting offshore wind need to keep in mind, is that people who are local stakeholders, people who live in communities that are adjacent to offshore wind turbine installations, need to really emphasize that the benefit really is going to be local. And I think that it's important to talk about the proximate impacts, on energy prices, but also the distal impacts, meaning the future impacts. I mean, one of the things that I've discussed with people who live in these communities is the idea that, people, are concerned about their children and grandchildren. And if climate change does, create an increase in storms, increase in sea level, that's going to impact whether or not their communities are even going to exist in 50 or 100 years. So I think that it's important to discuss these things in relation to how it's going to impact the local community, and also socioeconomic impacts as well. One of the things that was surprisingly came up in my conversations with people who live near the Jersey Shore is the degree to which they're interested in how this is going to affect jobs, how this is going to, promote more jobs, and how it's going to help more lower socioeconomic communities that might not be right near the shore, but maybe 25 miles in, that are looking for the ways in which this is going to help provide jobs for people. So that's an important consideration when talking to people and presenting information about offshore wind. Next, they discuss the fact that sound and visual impacts are strongly tied to annoyance and opposition. Annoyance and opposition related to actual or expected sound and visual impacts are well documented throughout the literature. In some cases, annoyance and other impacts are ignored, downplayed, or assumed to be absent or inconsequential by developers and policymakers, which may exacerbate conflict and distrust among people who are members of the community. Now, this one comes up all the time. Almost everyone who I discuss the offshore wind discuss the visual impact. Is this going to affect my perception of the sunrise? Is this going to impact, what I hear in the morning? Am I going to hear something which sounds like an engine or a locomotive? Or is this going to be something which is relatively, soundless and quiet? Now, one of the things that people seem to believe with offshore wind is that these installations are going to be directly 5 feet from where the tide comes in, where the waves are crashing. In reality, many of these wind turbines are going to be put many miles off the coast where they're not going to be visible at all because they are going to be off the horizon. But this is something which is, for those that own boats, for instance, that like to go out into the sea, yes, they are going to, if they take their vessel out 5 or 10 miles, they are going to come across these wind turbines, and it's going to affect them. So I think that one needs to consider that people's aesthetic judgment, and this goes back to their attachment to place. These structures were never there before, and they will permanently alter, people's visual ecology of this environment. So I think that this is something which always comes up with wind energy, and I think that it's important for all those that are going to present to the community about wind energy to understand that this is always going to be a concern by everyone that lives adjacent, and in terms of, these offshore wind, if they don't live adjacent, whose jobs, whether they be fishermen or whether they take tours out, it's going to impact them potentially. So they're worried about this, and it's, a concern that they have a legitimate right to have. Next, to discuss that environmental concerns matter, though perhaps less than other factors. Environmental concerns correlate with wind energy acceptance, but the strength of that correlation may be lower than that of other factors like socioeconomic impacts. Also, the direction of the correlation remains unclear. This is an important point, that, at the end of the day, economic concerns really do play an enormous role in people's decisions among almost anything. So if people see an economic benefit to themselves, that might override their environmental concerns to a certain degree. Now, of course, I think that environmental concerns always play some role. And I think that you'll be very rare to find individuals that have absolutely no concern about the environment, or at least the way in which our behavior, our activities, the impact of that on the environment affecting future generations. Given the fact that, everyone has ties to the future in terms of children or, relatives, nieces, nephews that, ultimately are going to grow up and living in a world that's going to be impacted by, our choices. I think that that's an important, but it's not as important as, for most people, the economic benefit that it might have for them. So I think that this is an important thing to keep in mind, is that, stressing the importance of the environmental impact of installing wind energy is important, but I think it's also equally important, if not more important, to talk about the economic benefits and the economic impacts as well. Next, the meta-analysis suggests that distance from turbines affects other variables, but alone its influence is unclear. The proximity hypothesis has yielded confounding findings in the literature. What is known is that an individual's distance from existing turbines affects a lot of other variable correlates, such as visual, sound, and socioeconomic impacts. So again, people who live close to a terrestrial turbine, they may be getting an economic benefit from it. For instance, some farms that allow wind turbines to be installed on their property get free electricity as part of the plan of installing this. So that's an economic benefit, and particularly if you have an energy-intensive farm, it may play a really big role in your acceptance of this. So, and you might be willing to tolerate, the noise if you're used to the sounds of farm equipment and things like that. Offshore wind is a little bit different because, again, people are not going to be living proximate to these wind turbines. They're going to be offshore by several miles, so the effect of sound is going to be less. But again, as I said earlier, the visual effect, is going to be very large. But I'm sure that with this bridge that's in my background right here, probably when this was built in the 1920s, people were worried about the visual impact that it would have on the community, and probably people were concerned about will it ruin our aesthetic view of the city. So but today people love the bridge. They someone just, as I was recording this right now, someone just walked out and took a photograph of it. So maybe that's the future of some of these turbine projects. Something to keep in mind. The next suggestion in this meta-analysis is that other variables also affect acceptance, and the understanding of these is evolving. Researchers have proposed a wide range of other variables potentially correlated to wind energy acceptance, many of which deserve further study. Over time, the addition of more possible correlates adds to the depth of understanding in this field. An example that I would give of this is that I don't think that I would have predicted when I began doing research in offshore wind that the impact on marine wildlife would be such a huge issue in the minds of many people. So it turns out, though, that that's the number one thing that people have brought up whenever I have talked to people in coastal communities about the impact of wind. This is why I think it's so important for researchers to have their own new research on offshore wind to study how it might be different than terrestrial wind farms. But we're only really beginning to understand, as these wind farms, begin to be installed throughout the world, how people think about wind, this type of wind energy, and its long-term impacts on how people will accept it in the long run. Again, a number of questions remain unresolved after 3 decades of research in this field. And so the meta-analysis provides specific areas for future research. A widespread representative random survey should be conducted in North America. Previous studies on the acceptance of wind energy in North America have focused only on one or a few wind facilities. A more geographically representative survey examining the variables discussed in this paper would greatly advance the state of knowledge in this field. So always, more research is necessary. And so I think it really would be useful for one of the larger social surveys in the country. This one is the General Social Survey at the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, where they survey thousands of people on their opinions. It would be useful to have a survey like this question a representative sample of the American population about wind energy. But the issue here is this: with offshore wind, I think it's important to talk to people not that live in Minnesota or Colorado, but people who live in New Jersey, in New York, in Connecticut, people whose direct communities will be affected by offshore wind. So I think a separate research project really needs to be done looking at people who live in coastal states, and particularly people who live in coastal communities, to understand what their concerns may be about the installation of these projects in their communities. Okay, because I do believe that terrestrial and offshore wind have several differences that need to be parsed out from a research perspective. Individuals living closest to turbines should be oversampled. The detailed experiences and attitudes of those living closest to turbines within a half a mile have not been well captured. Future research should oversample this group and analyze their responses as a group that's distinct from those living further away. Now, this is what I was basically saying in the previous slide. We really need to have a survey that oversamples people who live in communities that are adjacent to the installation of these wind farms that are offshore. I think that this is something that is not easy to do, but it's possible to, do a survey. And in a later module, I'll be presenting data from a study that I did in New Jersey where we looked at people who lived closer to the shore and further from the shore, and to determine whether or not attitudes changed. And also we looked at people who visit the shore more often or less often, to see if that's a variable that does affect whether or not people have acceptance. But I think it's very important for us to go into communities that are directly affected in order to get and ascertain people who are really the stakeholders in the installation of these facilities. Comparability of case studies should be enhanced. Discrete case studies should utilize some standardized survey items and protocols to facilitate comparison with data collected at different sites by other researchers. Causation should be identified where possible. Many studies have used regression techniques to tease out competing correlates of acceptance. In many cases, the direction of influence of these correlates is not understood. Now, you might not be a mathematician. That little triangle on the side there is a very common figure in correlation, partial correlation. It doesn't really, matter. This is more of a slide for researchers. I think it's important for us to develop standardized measures that we can use in various communities and various contexts where we measure environmental attitudes and beliefs and behaviors so that we can have fair comparisons across studies. One of the problems with research as it stands is that a lot of studies are done in a vacuum. And so it's very hard to compare, apples to oranges from one study that uses one measure by certain researchers and other measures that use other measures that are developed by different researchers. So I think that that's an important thing, to have something that's standardized that we can use across various studies. Next, wind energy acceptance should be compared with acceptance of other energy sources. Only a few North American studies have examined wind acceptance in concert with acceptance of other energy sources. Future research should attempt to do so to provide a mechanism for comparison. So this is something that I have done in my research with, that will be explained in a future module, is to try to get, how people's attitudes within participant measure, how people think about wind energy with the alternatives. Whether or not wind is correlated with people's acceptance of nuclear, solar, and other types of fossil fuel energy sources. And I think that it's important for us to understand this, to see whether or not there is a structure underneath the correlation of acceptance of these different energy sources. So I think that that's an interesting thing that I'll be talking about in a later module. Next, they suggest that a future direction of research should be change in acceptance over time should be studied. Longitudinal studies of acceptance before, during, and after wind project construction have revealed interesting changes in the European literature, but they've rarely been conducted in North America. But that study only covered the development and planning periods, leaving construction post-construction period in question. So basically what's being addressed here is the fact that there are longitudinal changes that can occur. People might be very opposed to offshore wind initially and might participate in community meetings and hold up signs and put signs in their front lawn that are against wind turbines. But maybe over time they begin to accept it. Maybe over time they begin to like it. I mean, as I said earlier, lots of infrastructure projects are hated at the beginning, and there's a great amount of protest and objection. But in the end, people accept it. For instance, a lot of people in Philadelphia were opposed to a certain bicycle lane being installed. And there were community meetings in which people got very angry enough to threaten people's lives over the installation of a bike path. It's now 5 years since that path has been installed, and no one talks about it because it's just been accepted as that is what it is. So I think that that's one of the things that you find with lots of these projects is that even though initially there's great opposition, that eventually there's acceptance, and then future generations just accept this as the environment that we have. The example that I have is the bridge in my background in this that you can see if I turn there, is that now people love that, and maybe that will be the case with some of these offshore wind installations. Next, annoyance survey data should be combined with measured or modeled sound level data. A number of surveys have asked respondents about their level of annoyance and perceived health impacts from wind turbine sound, but very few have correlated those data to measured or modeled sound level data. Varying development process models and experiences should be studied. Participation in, perceptions of, and resident preferences for wind facility developments and process are not well understood. So I think that we need to better understand the degree to which wind turbines produce sound that's going to be annoying. Now, I do think that one of the things we need to keep in mind with offshore wind is that it's going to be so far from the shore that it's not going to be, you can't hear them from that distance, but you might be able to see them in the far distance. And one of the things that people have brought up is the idea with the sunrise flickering, because these wind turbines are going to affect the sun. Now, we need to do more research on this annoyance factor that comes up when you talk to people who are in these communities. And, we can do a better job of modeling that and maybe take steps to moderate the impact of that on people. But it does come up when you have conversations with people in these communities. The next suggestion is that compensation mechanisms should be compared more rigorously. More research is needed to understand appropriate and acceptable compensation mechanisms for individuals and communities, such as local ownership and investment opportunities, community compensation schemes, and monetary community benefits. Now, I think it's very important to keep this in mind, that people are interested in how this might impact the socioeconomic status of their communities. And I think it's very important for those individuals that are impacted by these installations to understand that these are going to produce jobs, not just in terms of construction immediately, but also in the upkeep and maintenance of these facilities as well. And not just people who are directly involved in the production of electricity, but also those that may own boats that are fishermen who might be able to ferry individuals from pylon to pylon over the course of time when they're not fishing. So it could be a supplementary income for many people. But also, I think it's important to talk to individuals who might not, be able to actively participate in that way, that, maybe electricity prices for the community could be less, but also to emphasize the fact that if we don't make these kinds of changes and, we allow climate change to result in sea level rise, it's going to be very expensive in the long run for people to keep their coastal communities, because there will be more storms, there is going to be sea level rise, which will lead to erosion, and this is something that will be devastating economically. So I always think that's something that is important to keep in mind and to remind people when discussing offshore wind. So, in a related sense, resident perceptions of property values impacts should be studied in greater depth. Although recent large-scale research has not found significant property value impact on homes near wind facilities, these impacts may exist in some cases, and the perception of value impacts among local residents could exist, but it's not well understood. Implementation of research recommendations should be studied. Now, this I think is particularly important with offshore wind, because one needs to keep in mind that because of the limited availability of coastal land, that results in the fact that coastal land is very expensive, and therefore people are really concerned about their property values. So when people think that a wind turbine is going to go a couple meters from their property line, they have a legitimate concern about how it might impact their property value. And even though these wind turbines are going to be far off in the distance, people's perceptions still are impacted by this. And so I think that this is something that needs to be studied. And economists and those that are skilled at being able to assess these things would be the best at being able to do that. But I think there is room for future research on how the impact on community values, property values, is a really important thing to keep in mind. Finally, research is needed to understand the effects and implementation of strategies proposed in the literature during the development of policymaking process. Researchers should continue to develop frameworks for wind project planning that increase community engagement and reduces the conflict and injustice. So I do think that we need more research on people's perceptions, communities' perceptions. One thing that when talking to people in communities that are near where proposed sites are, people discuss about the fact that, you know, they're thinking of putting turbines closer to the shore in poorer communities and further from the shore in wealthier communities. And people are worried about the economic impact that this is going to have on them, on their livelihoods. So I do think that more research, again, this is related to the last point that was being made, that it would be really, really helpful, though, for researchers to develop frameworks for how to, in general, approach communities in order to prevent the kinds of objections that we see so often in the development of this future technology. Now, an important caveat that I want to make is about this meta-analysis in particular is that it was primarily based on research having to do with terrestrial wind turbines, not offshore wind. So I think that it's important to take into account with offshore wind the types of communities, the type of industries, the impact on different non-human species. A lot of the terrestrial research deals with avian impacts. Of course, with offshore wind, a lot of the issues that people brought up are with non-human species mammals that are marine mammals. So I think that it's important that we understand that offshore wind may be a different category of research that we need to develop. So that's just one caveat I wanted to put at the end of this. So in summary, in 2017, two scientists from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a meta-analysis of 30 years of social science research on how people think about wind energy. They provide a set of suggestions on how to deal with the public about the introduction of wind energy in communities, and these suggestions provide a set of very useful guidelines for scientists who may not be behavioral researchers for dealing with the general public. So I really think that it's a worthwhile read. I will link to it in the module on Canvas, and I think that there are lots of lessons to be learned for developing future research on offshore wind energy. And so in the next part, what I'm going to talk about is in part 8, a little project that I did with my students. So it might be of interest to educators who might have college students or high school students, because it describes a little study that I did teaching students how to do survey research. So thanks for watching this, and I hope that you have as beautiful a day as we're having here in Philadelphia, here at Cherry Street Pier. Thanks a lot.